Hello.
Our story begins on Ilum with a group of younglings. They traveled with the Grand Master as per usual. As the younglings went into the caverns inside the Jedi Temple on Ilum to search for their kyber crystals, a small bug released itself from the ice. The younglings were all filled with optimism and excitement for this new endeavor in their journey as Jedi. They looked at the caverns and quickly descended into different directions to claim their crystals. Dak Alur was one of these students, and he looked rigorously for the kyber crystal that called to him. He continued through the icy caverns alone, and trusted the Force to guide him to what would be his. He came across a wall of solid ice, and he looked at it, placing his hand against the wall and feeling water melt beneath his fingers. It was chilly on the fingertips, but it continued to melt until his hand was covered in water. The little glow he thought he saw vanished from his line of sight, and he realized it was nothing. He felt the sharp pain seep into his skin. He whipped his hand back and saw in his hand the kyber crystal. A smile formed around Dak's face, and he started back to the edge of the caverns to meet up with his peers and Grandmaster Yoda. He waited with Yoda for a number of minutes as his peers joined him and the rest of his classmates who had gotten there before him. When everything was finished, they got back inside their transport and departed for Coruscant. Yoda was instructing the students on how to build their lightsabers. Everything was going fine until he felt a sharp sting in his hand. He turned over and the kid next to him was wobbling. He was reaching out to him almost in a confused manner. Yoda turned back, not even noticing that his hand was hurt, and asked if Dak was alright. The boy's visions faded in and out and he fell backwards. Yoda used the Force to cushion his fall, before asking Professor Hyang to take the child into the back. The elder droid got up from one of Dak's peers and came over, lifting the boy up and moving into a different part of the vessel. Yoda picked up the kyber crystal that was on the ground and placed it inside of his robes. He continued instructing the students on how to build their lightsabers. The incident happened closer to the end of their trip, and so by the time they got back to Coruscant, Yoda had been requested to the executive building. There were issues brewing in the Mid-Rim. Chancellor Palpatine was worried about a coming war, and he had been trying to raise an army, but was consistently being blocked by Senator Amidala. Palpatine was reeling Yoda into his palms. With the Clone Wars coming, it would only be a matter of time until the Jedi were completely destroyed. Inside the Jedi Temple, the youngling was brought into the medical wing. While they were inside the vessel, Dak had been foaming out of the mouth and shaking rapidly. Professor Hyang had his arms bitten and so forth, but being that he was a droid, it never affected him. He just tried to calm the young Jedi so he wouldn't hurt his own teeth. Hyang put him under and personally took him inside the Jedi Temple, though he didn't stay around for too long because he had another group of younglings to take to the temple on Ilum. In the coming minutes, Dak would be laid down on a medical bed, and within moments of his head touching the pillow, he saw his eyes open and he scanned the room. Human no more. Dak climbed off the bed and slid to the ground, his voice crackling and cackling with no discernible syllables or words. He crawled on the floor with twitching bones and trembling skin. As he got up and moved towards the door, the room was silent. There were a couple other Jedi in the room. They were sleeping, so they never saw it coming. Dak slowly moved around the room, biting their wrists in their hands. The people were silent, but as Dak became more and more unlike a human being, he became more the transmitter of the disease. Instead of hours, it only took minutes for those who were inside the room to be turned into the undead. They wandered around the room, getting up from their beds and aimlessly walking around. A couple of them were Jedi Knights, and another one of them was a Master. The Force flowing through them only made them more deadly. With nothing to attract them, they didn't move. That lasted until one of the medical droids assigned to take care of them came into the room to put them back to bed. When they couldn't get their patients to move back to their beds, they summoned a couple of other Jedi medics, and when the doors opened, the beginning of the end began. The first medic was tackled, and their cries echoed out through the halls of the temple. It was the early evening, and the temple was preparing for nighttime. Younglings with their teachers for their final instruction of the day, masters and knights having their final discussions or meals of the night, members meditating in peaceful areas around the temple, and others using their lightsabers to train. The temple was peaceful. There was no war, no plotting. There was just peace. Until no longer it was. The creatures in the medical wing crawled out from their enclosure and were released upon the Jedi Temple. One of those in the area was Jedi Master Plo Koon, who came to see what the issue was. He came when he heard someone cry out and scream out what sounded to be pain. As he rounded the corner, he looked at the ground and saw puddles of blood, and from them, footprints leading down the hall. Plo ran forward and knelt down, looking at the pile of blood before turning his head to look down the hallway. He couldn't see anything, and he was confused, until he heard some more wretched howls. Plo rose to his feet and ran forward, with his hand on his belt, in case he needed to grab his lightsaber. He raced down the hallway and looked across it, but it was still empty. The howls became more and more distant as he heard a lightsaber ignite to his left. Plo turned his head as quickly as he could to hear someone begging someone else to stop before they were silenced. Plo ran forward and flew around the corner to see someone on their back with another Jedi on top of them. Their face dug into their shoulder before turning around to the hissing sound of Plo's lightsaber. He demanded the person in front of him to stop. The creature did listen, as they let go of the person's shoulder and slowly turned its head. Chloe looked at the person who was lying on the ground with their neck ripped to pieces. Their eyes started to flicker and their body began to twist and turn. Chloe's attention turned to the other Jedi, who leapt up towards them. Chloe reached out his hand with the force and stopped the person in their tracks. He asked the one on their back if they were alright, and their body continued to twitch until their eyes rolled back into the back of their head, and they became still. Chloe was horrified. His focus still kept on holding the one Jedi off the ground. He stood firm, and then that strength vanished out from under him as a rising pain filled his arm and he turned back to see something biting him. He released his grip on another Jedi, and they fell down, grabbing a hold of his shoulder and throwing him backwards. Chloe's last sights were of the ceiling of the temple as the world became dark, and he became one of the corrupted. Far away from this carnage inside the executive building, there was a much worse carnage. The Grand Master was talking with Palpatine when everything in his life broke down, and he turned into a ferocious monster. Palpatine followed in his footsteps with a massive gouge in his arm. The executive building was in complete disarray. The temple was beginning to reflect what was being started across the city. It was pandemonium. Jedi Masters were trying to stop their peers, and because they were Jedi, they didn't pull their weapons on their friends or their students. Inside of one of the youngling rooms was a group of students who were with their teacher. They were completely unaware of anything happening. Their little early evening class was wrapping up. Zat and Kantuni led the class out of the room, with their teacher behind them. The instructor noticed that something seemed off within the Force. The temple seemed a little odd, but he couldn't put a finger on it. Master Timio told his students that they should quickly make their way back to their rooms. Petro asked the Jedi Master what was wrong, and he told them that he didn't know, but until he did, he wanted them to go to their rooms so they could get some rest and stay safe. The Jedi instructor told his students he would walk with them to the location of their rooms. Gatuni and Biff were talking about what they thought was going on. Ganodi joined the conversation as Master Timio looked around, keeping his eyes peeled. He grabbed the student in front of him, in the front of the line, and told him to stop. His voice was quiet, and he pulled the student close to him, and he lowered himself down to their level and whispered into their ears to stay quiet and stick close to him. The group of younglings turned their attention toward their instructor as they followed him one by one into the hallway and around the corner. He wasn't moving quickly, but his actions had each member of the class on edge. It was odd. There was no reason for Master Timio to feel as if something had happened inside the Jedi Temple. Nothing could happen. It was a time of peace. Petra was the only one inside the class who wasn't reacting to the obvious stress of the situation. He was being a bit of a goober. He was joking with Gungi, who was as silent as a mouse. They treaded through the halls of the Jedi Temple, and Master Timio looked down the far hall and decided that despite his original thoughts, it might be best to avoid the youngling hall. There was a reason for this, but Master Timio wasn't telling his students. He kept ushering them into different directions, though for each youngling it became more and more realistic. The howls in the distance and the cries of fear and agony were grabbing their attention. Master Timio told the children to simmer down, and he found a training room. He ushered them into the room and told them to keep the lights off and stay in the dark. He pushed each of them to a corner of the room and looked around. It wasn't pitch black, but he couldn't see everything. Timio looked for the door, found it, and then locked it, making sure there were no other doors or ways into the room. His efforts didn't go in vain, as it was the only door into the training facility. Timio looked around some more and found a ventilation shaft. He made it entirely clear to the children that it was there. He had no intention of them using it, he just wanted to make sure they knew it was there. The kids were then told to stay as quiet as possible as he went into the corner of the room and pressed against the wall, opening up a small panel. He looked at the internal elements of the box, and he took something out before closing the box back up. It was a small light, and Timio told the younglings to have it on the dimmer setting until he could figure out everything that was going on around here. Master Timio didn't really have much he could do. He was only an instructor-level teacher, and an elder one at that. He moved to the door and put his head up against it. He could hear feet shuffling across the carpet, but there were no cries or howls. It was eerily silent. The shuffling was quick. The Jedi Master then remembered that there was a security recording in the room. It'd be the only way for him to access the hallways and see what was going on. It was probably the worst thing he could have done. When he opened up the hologram, he saw nothing but dead bodies littering the temple. Those who weren't dead or clearly torn apart on the ground were standing idly with liquid markings across their robes. Timio held his breath. He didn't know what this was. It didn't seem real. He pinched himself to make sure it was, and to his dismay, he was living through what seemed to be some sort of infection. As he was looking at it, a banging came from the door. He dropped the hologram and he smacked into the floor. What also didn't help was the audible gasp from the children in the corner of the room. Timio pressed his fingers to his lips and bent down, picking up the device that fell from his hands. The person outside the room continued banging on the door until they couldn't anymore. The sound of a lightsaber ignited and more howls followed it. The kids all looked at each other in fear of what could be happening. Timio walked back to the door and pressed his ear against it again. There was nothing but silence. Timio fell backwards and looked at the kids. and quietly pointed towards the ventilation shaft. He got back to his feet as the howling outside the room only continued to echo. Timio shuffled over to the vent and whispered to them. He told them to not trust anyone, do not engage with anyone, and most of all, stay silent. The kids looked at him, their breathing only getting heavier as they moved into the vents and away from the training room. They had their little light with them, and Zat told the group that they should turn it off, just in case. It was mutually agreed upon that they should. Master Timio knelt down in the center of the training room after putting the vent back on and patiently waited. He didn't know what would come, but the racing in his heart only told him to be more afraid and less sturdy. He tried to silence those fight or flight reflexes, but he couldn't. These creatures could sense his presence. Regardless of how alive or dead they were, they felt Master Timio through the force. And as their banging came to an end, the door burst again. Timio rose to his feet, turning all the training droids as they sped out from the holding chambers, and he turned on the shield that surrounded the training arena. He looked at the creatures as they reacted to the little drones. They were so rabid, so angry, so hungry. It was terrifying to lay eyes onto them, because as he stood there, the noise only created a swarm. Their howls and angry cackles only made the experience more frightening. He thought he made a smart decision, but at this point, Timio was only buying himself time to live. With that being said, he was only giving himself time to live in a perpetual state of fear. Knowing this, he grabbed his Jedi weapon and ignited it. The creatures could hear it reverberate from the interior of the ray shield, and they turned their attention to him. The drones continued to do what they were programmed to do, but they were no longer enough to get the attention away from the creatures. The ray shields lowered and Timio swung his lightsaber, and as he did, he was thrown backwards with the force. He twisted and turned across the hard floors of the training room as he got up to try and defend himself, but they were too quick. One of the creatures used their lightsaber and the rest of them swarmed him. All that could be heard from the kid's perspective was Master Timio crying out in agony as his pain was silenced and the howls of terror only continued to fill the halls. They all lowered themselves down into the vents. This was especially hard for Gungi, but they needed to figure out a plan of escape. If they didn't do that, then they would be trapped inside of here indefinitely. They scrambled through their thoughts, distant lightsaber ignitions and even explosions sounded, but then they were silenced. Kenobi then asked where they were, and Zat told them that there was a chance they could be in two different locations. He wasn't sure. Based on the temple map, they could be either under or over the Jedi archives, or they could be somewhere close to the communication room. Petro jumped up, his head slammed into the top of the vent, and an echo rolled out from the vents. Some of the creatures reacted to it by twisting their heads and making a couple audible remarks, but nothing more than that. Katuni told Petro that he needed to be more careful. If he wasn't, then he could endanger all of them. He apologized and let Zat take the lead, considering he knew the layout of the temple better than anyone else in the group. As it turns out, they were near the communication room, so they climbed around, and when they got there, they looked up through a hollowed-out vent. They couldn't see anyone in the room, so Gungi removed a small hole in the vent and then held it as the peers rushed out. Biff and Kenobi ran up to the sides of the room and locked both doors. At the same time, Zat touched the controls on the panel to make sure that when the hologram turned on, it was inaudible. They at this point figured out that sound attracted these monsters. The hologram opened up and Zat saw information that horrified him. What he did was accidentally bringing it up, and he was watching a live recording of the executive building. It was pandemonium. Republic troopers, which were just civilians, who joined the Republic militia, were sent to hold down the facility. It was easy to stop the senators and representatives, but Palpatine and Yoda were moving around like demons possessed. Their speed was unstoppable, and they both used powers that no one could really understand. The militia was able to put down these creatures for the most part, but the disease was rapidly spreading. Though something that Zat noticed is that there was no coverage of the Jedi Temple. In other words, no one knew what was happening here. There was absolutely no knowledge on what was happening inside the temple. Petra asked them what they should do, and Kenobi suggested that they get out of the temple and tell someone. Who could they tell though? All they knew was life inside the Jedi Temple, and they only knew authority figures inside the temple. Gungi let out a small growl, and Zat came forward agreeing they should go back to the vents and continue sneaking around. There might be more survivors that could lead them out of the temple. It was agreed, and Zat turned off the hologram as they got inside the vents and crawled away. What was most terrifying about this experience is the fact that the people who became these creatures were dormant the entire time, until they were alerted. As they crawled through, one of the vents they climbed through permitted them vision of the interior of the Great Hall. While Timio saw everything from his hologram, the kids finally really saw everything for the first time here. These beings simply stood without direction or motive. Their entire essence was eerie, and for the kids of the Force, they could feel nothing but a sense of eternal suffering. What made things worse was seeing countless council members in the hallways. Some of them were completely dead like Opa Rancisis or Yariel Poof. Others like Depa Balaba and Kiare Mundi were mindless drones stumbling around with massive holes missing in parts of their bodies, like a neck or an arm or even a leg. The younglings saw this as exclusively nightmare fuel. It was the worst thing to imagine seeing. As they were climbing through above the massive hallways, they could see a couple Padawan-aged Jedi moving through the halls. All of them were aged around 16 to 19, and they were sticking by each other's side. They were quietly moving about, and they had the same idea as the younglings. As the Padawans gave each other a boost up to the vents, Gungi and Zat removed the vent cover so they could climb in. They showed no signs of illness, and so they were allowed to join them, at least from their perspective at the moment. The first Padawan to enter almost panicked when she grabbed the vent and it opened up from inside. But the sight of the younglings warmed her heart as she squeezed into the vent, lying down almost completely just to fit, which is something the following two Padawans did as they got into the vent. They spoke quietly to each other, asking about what was happening and so on. The Padawans had a bit more knowledge, and they told the younglings that there was some sort of disease brought from another planet. It started in the medical wing, which was a bloody mess, but pretty much empty at this point. From the medical wing it spread. They expressed that they hadn't found a safe place to stay. They also told the younglings that cutting off these creatures' heads seemed to help with everything. It at least slowed them down. Zat told them that they weren't outfitted with lightsabers yet, they hadn't gone to Ilum to get them. One of the Padawans told them that inside the training rooms they could find spare lightsabers that they wanted, and they would have enough strength to cut through their bodies. But they suggested it wasn't worth it. Their main concern was getting out of the temple. Zat told the Padawans the events transpiring in the executive building. It didn't make any sense. The Padawans also said that they noticed that the more powerful Force-sensitive beings became more dangerous hunters. While the Padawans were able to hide or just avoid them, it was typically only around lesser Force-sensitive creatures that they were able to do this. A couple of their peers died by interacting with council members and so on. They expressed that they had killed what was left of even Peel. It was also terrible, but they were safe now. That is until a screeching echoed out. There was so much weight inside the vents, and because they hadn't moved or redistributed the weight, inside the vent it shifted inwards and crashed down. The younglings and Padawans fell down onto the carpets, but the sound of the vent crashing down alerted the undead. The Padawans got up and ignited their weapons. A number of creatures poured over, running at different speeds, some of them in full sprints, others in gimpy hobbles, all of them hungry. The Padawans got in front of the younglings and pointed them down one of the other directions. One of the three Padawans took the point of the younglings as they ran forward. The other two could be heard swinging, connecting with the creatures that came after them. Their howls were another reminder of the constant pain their trapped souls endured during their final moments of life. The children followed closely behind the Padawan as the howls only got closer and closer. As one of the younglings turned around, they tripped over an already ripped apart body. None of the other younglings noticed that Petro fell, and neither did the other two Padawans who passed by him before realizing it had fallen. He didn't have a chance the second he realized he was surrounded by the Horde. The Padawans knew they couldn't save him as they turned around and continued running. The sheer terror was far too much. As they pressed forward, Biff was sideswiped by a monster that leapt up a number of stories to get to their level and lunged straight into the youngling. He was beyond saving, which forced the Padawan who was holding up the rear to cut down the creature and then kill the already bitten Biff. It was a horrendous thing to do. While they were rushing forward, they were stopped. Jedi Councilmember Coleman Trebor dropped down from the ceiling and hissed at the Padawan in the lead. She threw a lightsaber forward, but with the force it was thrown from her hands into the corner. Kennedy looked next to them and saw a door and tried to open it, but it was locked. She, Zat, Katuni, and Gungi banged on the door, begging whoever was inside of it to let them in. As they kept banging, one of the Padawans was jumped. His cries led the Padawans and younglings to panic more. The Jedi leading the way was able to get her lightsaber just in time, but she was on her back, holding Coleman off of her as best as she could. His bites nearing her face with each passing second until a lightsaber ignited and cut through Coleman's head. The Padawan was pulled backwards and the man with the lightsaber used the force to push the other creatures back just enough as they ran back into the room. The doors slammed shut. Kennedy, Gungi, Katuni, and Zat looked around and they were in a small training room on the outskirts of the temple. When they looked back, they saw both Anakin Skywalker and Obi-Wan Kenobi, who were locking up the room. In the corner of their room was a number of burnt bodies. The Padawans asked what they were doing, and Obi-Wan told them they were preparing to exterminate the disease. They figured out that if they burned the bodies, they killed off the creature's disease, so they were going to burn the entire temple to the ground. The banging at the door only continued to increase. Skywalker turned back and told the younglings that they were going to be jumping out that window. Katuni asked about the other survivors in the temple. Obi-Wan informed her that there weren't any. The council members were rampaging through everything. They were much faster and more aggressive than the rest of the creatures and the hive. Anakin turned towards the exit and told the younglings to get ready to jump. They were all going to use the force to brace their fall. The Padawans got to the edge with the younglings as Obi-Wan turned back. The door burst open. His lightsaber and Anakin's ignited once more as they swung forward, cutting through the creatures that approached. The two Padawans and four younglings leapt out the window as Anakin rolled an explosive firebomb under the Horde approaching them. It smashed open and lit a number of creatures on fire. As they were on fire, they continued the charge, which made everything all the more terrifying. The fire, on the other hand, cut off the entrance to the training room and began to spread. With so many dead bodies around, it didn't take long for pieces of the temple to catch on fire. For the survivors inside the temple, they had three choices: burn to death, be eaten to death, or escape. Anakin and Obi-Wan quickly did their best to cover everyone's escape before Obi-Wan pushed Skywalker towards the edge and he jumped. After he escaped, Obi-Wan was right behind him, but his leg got caught before he tumbled downwards. The creature lobbed themselves out of the training room and down towards the surface of the city. Without the knowledge to protect themselves, they crashed down into the city floors and died. They slammed down by those who had already landed, and by the Padawans, those were cut into pieces just to make sure everything was really dead. Anakin saw Obi-Wan flying down without stopping himself. He reached out and slowed his fall for his master, asking him why he wasn't stopping himself. Obi-Wan looked at Anakin and told him he got bitten. Anakin, without a second of hearing this, asked where, and Obi-Wan pointed towards it. Skywalker ignited his lightsaber and slid it across Obi-Wan's leg, and he retched in pain. He looked over at Anakin, and his apprentice held his lightsaber to his face. Anakin's eyes were watered with tears in fear of having to kill his master, already feeling terrible over hurting him. But luckily for him, his quick thinking saved Obi-Wan's life. Unlike Biff, the infection stopped in his legs, and he was permitted to survive the disease. Obi-Wan asked, and Anakin cut him off. He didn't know. He was just hoping it would help. He helped Obi-Wan up, and they made their way through the streets of the late-night Coruscant city. Because of the fire started inside the temple, it would be allowed to burn for several hours along the outer edge of the interior of the temple. This trapped the creatures inside and burned them to the ground. With the help of some of the other Jedi who were still inside the temple, who noticed that the fire killed the infected, they spread the fire before escaping themselves. The scene inside the executive building wasn't much better. Coruscant had a huge militia force, and it took them the entire duration of the night to extinguish the threats. It was horrendous. There were only a few survivors of the purge from the executive building. Most of everyone had died. The Chancellor and the Grand Master were killed after extensive attacks and pressure. With so many senators and Jedi killed in the process, the Republic had to do a great reset. The temple, not more than a day after the incident, would collapse. While the fires were widespread, the structural damage took time to tear down the structure. Once it was done, the galaxy was left in fear of the disease that no longer was. People close to Palpatine went into the executive building to take DNA samples of the dead and take them to Republic facilities, so they could figure out the cause of it. For people like Tarkin, the thought of a weaponized disease was all the more intriguing. He wanted samples so he could use it against any potential enemies. With so many dead, many of which would have been a part of the future Separatist alliance, Dooku put a hold on the attention to starting a rebellion and became Chancellor of the Republic, which allowed him to save the Republic from itself. Anakin and Obi-Wan took the younglings and Padawans and regrouped with a couple of other survivors, including Shaak Ti and Kit Fisto, so they could also restart. The terror of the disease would haunt them all for the rest of their lives, but their survival was all that mattered at the end of a night of the living dead. And that, my friends, is our Halloween special. Again, special thanks to Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Darth Revan, Erebus, Pimp Daddy Bane, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weebu 670, Anakish Dank, Runner, CT7567, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Johnny Naguin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeek, Gamer, Lord Callaghan, Lee Slayer 66, Madman Studios, Anakin 003, Fortis Legacy Star Wars, Lemon Knight, Rex the Wolf, the man with the first names, Dark Saint 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing for supporting the channel. Smash the like button on this video. If you want to see more behind the scenes stuff, go check out the Patreon. There is some cool stuff coming along with the Sith Clone Wars back this Saturday, November 4th. I'm excited. I hope you are too. Anyways, I'm going to talk about this real quick. I don't have much to say. It's a Halloween special. It really, don't take it that seriously. I wasn't really all that concerned with anything going on outside of the horror-filled interior of the story. So that's why I kind of just ended right where it was. Anyways, I don't really have anything else to say. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, happy Halloween!